Hello, and welcome to What a Scream, the podcast where I, your host, Miss Dolly, chats horror movies with a special guest every week. And in particular, we dissect and discuss in spoilerific detail horror movies that have to do with a particular theme or subject that I have previously randomly picked out of my little cup of horror. So this week, the theme is something that is quite emotive and it's quite close to my heart. It is LGBTQIA plus representation in horror films. I think it's so important to talk about in the aspect of horror because unfortunately, like the greater world, the LGBT plus community and the queer community have not been treated kindly by horror films. And unfortunately, a lot of the time it had to be coded into films. So we have seen recently that there is a lot more, thankfully, queer horror films or films that have LGBTQIA representation in them. And hopefully more will come to the forefront. So I'm going to give you a brief-ish history of queer horror. Two particular novels that have obviously influenced a lot of horror films, the Dorian Gray by Oscar Wilde and Frankenstein, the novel, they were both very queer coded. Obviously, Oscar Wilde was a gay man. And then in Frankenstein, we can see that, Victor was not really bothered by his fiancée and he wanted to create the perfect man. And, the monster just wanted to love and to be loved, but was heralded as a monster who didn't deserve it. And kind of we saw this symbolism of parental rejection that we can see when it comes to members of the queer community. The director of the films Frankenstein in 1931 and The Bride of Frankenstein in 1935 was James Whale, who was a gay man. He employed Colin Clive as Victor, and in Bride of Frankenstein, Ernest Thesiger, who played Dr. Septimus. They were both bisexual men. And in this film, we saw the fantasy of procreation without women. Two men wanted to create a being. So it is very queer coded. The ending was actually cut from Bride of Frankenstein because it went against the Hays Code. The ending was Elizabeth, Victor's wife's heart was going to be used for the bride. And it kind of symbolized the death of Victor's heterosexuality. Now, the Hays Code was a code that Hollywood movies had to go by. They couldn't show specific things. They banned, obviously, homosexuality. They banned overt sexuality in general. And a lot of other things were banned under this Hays Code. So anything, that was kind of queer within the film had to be very, very, very deeply coded, so as not to invite the wrath of the Hays Code. Then we saw Dracula's Daughter, which had a very lesbian vampire depiction. And this caused outrage from the Hays Code enforcers. The monsters of these movies were seen to be unnatural and against God's will. So we kind of see a lot of queer and LGBT plus community members. They kind of relate to the monsters a lot more, rather than the heroes. They see themselves as outcasts, chased with pitchforks by hetero people, and they have been, just completely ostracized and monstericized. I don't think that's a word, but I'm going to use it, by the general community. And me, myself, being a queer woman, I can definitely, I definitely did kind of relate more to the monsters, because I didn't feel natural, and I didn't feel like I fit in with everybody else. So after the 40s, a spate of sci-fi and invasion films kind of became quite fashionable, and this kind of represented the fear of communism, the fear of the Black civil rights movement, feminist movements, and the homosexuality kind of rights movement. The late 60s and 70s saw horror representing the terror that America already contained amongst its own people. So we saw Texas Chainsaw and Halloween. And then the 1980s slasher boom saw teenagers being punished for having sex, which kind of, you could say, almost mirrored the AIDS pandemic. So it kind of created a fear of your fellow American, created a lot of paranoia surrounding the LGBT community. So we saw the release of Nightmare on Elm Street 2, Freddy's Revenge, which, like, the queerness wasn't even coded. It was, no matter what the filmmaker said, that is a gay film. Our hero, he was a gay man. He broke the final girl formula, and it became a male main character. Even though we see Jessie, the character, as a kind of a damsel in distress. So the screenwriter for Nightmare on Elm Street 2 was gay, and he purposely queer coded it. And we see it as kind of Jessie's desire to come out is manifested in Freddy. And then we saw the release of The Lost Boys. Joel Schumacher, the director, is gay. It was released at the height of the AIDS epidemic again. And we kind of saw, vampirism as a metaphor of AIDS, to blood diseases. Then we saw, we're going to fast forward a bit, and we've got films like The Covenant, which is like all male witches, very kind of queer coded as well. Obviously, it was meant to kind of be appealing to teenage girls, the Twilight kind of, but it's kind of gay. Gayness has kind of always remained coded. There are very few kind of out gay characters in horror films, and even if they were very sidelined. They were jokes. They were victims. And then also, when it comes to horror, we can see the idea of the monstrous queer. Previously, I have talked about the monstrous feminine, and now we have this idea as the monstrous queer. So Hollywood kind of magnified a gay panic that queer people were monsters. We have Alfred Hitchcock's Rope, about two burgeoning killers, and there's a lot of sexual tension between the two men. And we've got this monstrous killer queer, as well as these kind of homosexual people that think they're better than the heteros. It paints a very bleak picture of queer people. So in obviously the 1950s and the 1960s, happening in culture and society, it was overtly in your face heteronormativity and strict gender roles. And from this came Alfred Hitchcock's Psycho, where Anthony Perkins, who was an out gay actor, played Norman Bates, who was he was a deadly portrayal of LGBT plus community members. It saw Norman Bates as dressing in female clothes and kind of becoming psychotic, and it portrayed a gender switching, or almost trans people as just being murderous men in women's clothing. And it played into the fear of the LGBT community. And unfortunately, due to this, violence on gay people multiplied after Psycho was released. So it had a very detrimental kind of effect on the queer community. And then this kind of narrative was continued in films like Dress to Kill and Cruising, unfortunately, which also led to violence on the LGBTQIA plus community. Hollywood then reduced its portrayal of gay killers, but unfortunately they turned their sights onto transgender people and were still exploiting them. We can see this in films like Sleepaway Camp. Even though that character isn't transgender, audiences took it that trans people were sick and homicidal. And we can see that again in Oscar-winning film Silence of the Lambs with the portrayal of the Buffalo Bill character. Even though this character is their transgender identity is kind of questionable, it's more of an obsession with women. And they were rejected medical gender reassignment due to their mental state. It is seen to be an anti-trans and anti-gay film. And we can also argue the point that if Bill thinks they are trans and a woman, that it is not up to cis people to decide that they are not. And also, you know, it portrays trans people as homicidal maniacs when in fact trans people and trans women in particular are more likely to be the victims of violent crimes and murder than to be the perpetrator of crimes. So we see this kind of filmmaker's intention versus the audience's kind of perception. So after Silence of the Lambs came out, again, it had a detrimental effect on the lives of trans people, of queer people, and members of the LGBT plus community. We saw bathroom laws being introduced in America that were literally called the Buffalo Bills, which is, you know, ridiculous carry on. You know, you don't go into a bathroom wondering what someone else's genitals look like. It's ridiculous. And anyone who argues about that, like, why are you so obsessed with someone else's genitals? Stop it. Stop it. You're the one that should be on a list somewhere. Anyway, we also saw this kind of thing of murderous bisexual women, like in the film of Basic Instinct, you know, that bisexual women were predators and, you know, will steal your girlfriends and kill your boyfriends. So I got a lot of that information there, that little brief history of kind of detrimental effects that horror has had on the LGBTQIA plus community. I got a lot of that information from a YouTube video by James Somerton called Monsters in the Closet, A History of LGBT Representation in Horror Cinema. And living in the day in the day and age that we are right now, it's good to start seeing a lot more positive representation for the LGBT plus community rather than it being monstrous. There is a lot more films that, you know, young people can kind of watch and know that they're not being vilified and they're not being out, you know, made out to be this horrible monster that, you know, the wider community should be afraid of. We have seen great LGBTQIA representation in films like Haute Tension or High Tension. Nightbreed by Clive Barker is a great film about finding your clique, finding your people. We have seen it even in The Haunting as far back as the 50s. The Rocky Horror Picture Show, I know it's slightly outdated with its language, but it is still a fun representation of queer horror. We've had Interview with the Vampire, Hellbent, Seed of Chucky, Jennifer's Body is a great one. And then also there's films like What Keeps You Alive, that is fantastic, based around a queer couple. It's a brilliant film. So the two films that myself and my special guest are going to talk about is Raw from 2016, directed by Julia Ducornau, and also Let the Right One In, the Swedish vampire film. So my special guests this week, they are a non-binary blogger and podcaster, and they go under the name of Philosophy and Fishnets, which kind of sum them up perfectly. And we have a great chat about queer horror. So I would like to introduce to What a Scream, Tadhg. How are you?
I'm good. I think everyone's in the same boat at the moment. It's kind of just trucking along, straight and narrow, keep focused on going forward, but I'm good. I'm keeping myself distracted with all things horror movies and fun things.
It is a great time to just knuckle down and watch all those horror films that you've been meaning to watch and get through all of Shudder.
Making my way.
Slowly making my way. And I've heard studies have said that horror fans are dealing with the pandemic better than anybody else, which I kind of believe.
I think so. We're possibly better equipped. All these different films about the world falling apart. We've got our skill set already.
I mean, don't get me wrong. Like, medication and gin has helped as well. But also watching The Walking Dead over and over again, just in case.
Just in case there's something you missed out on before.
So would you like to kind of introduce yourself and what you do and what you're all about?
So my name is Tadhg, and then I also have my socials, which is Fishnets and Philosophy, because philosophy is in my lifeblood. I did it in college, and it's just, I don't know, teaching people about philosophy, thinking philosophically about the world. That's just me, who I am. And then after I realized I was non-binary and I now use they, them pronouns, I realized that I really like wearing fishnets. So that's where my social name came from. So Fishnets and Philosophy. What I do, I'm in the standard 9 to 5 rat race, kind of just a standard job that has no creative outlets at all. So that's why I'm doing all my blogging, attempting to do podcasting, YouTube videos of me doing my makeup and just chatting, because any creative outlet I can get to distract myself from the fact that we are in a capitalist system.
Just that little thing there.
Just a little thing,
Need a little bit of a distraction from that.
Just a little bit. But I'm a queer, non-binary, creative person, and creativity's in my blood. My dad is an artist, so I don't know, I think I was just destined to be creative. There was no question about it. So I'm just a person who thinks and has big questions about the world, and I'd be a stereotypical social justice warrior in the sense that the social causes are something that I definitely care about a lot as well. So I think that's me in a nutshell.
So your interest in philosophy, do you find that lends it well to being a cinephile and in particular a horror movie kind of fan?
I definitely think so, because it's impossible for me to kind of watch a movie without some form of a critical hat on it. As in,
it's hard to switch off and just enjoy sometimes.
Exactly. I'm a massive nerd. If you look up the dictionary, there's probably a picture of my face there. But even with the superhero films, I love the Marvel films, I still approach it with a philosophical societal lens. I just can't switch off. But I definitely think it lends it well, and especially to horror, which is probably one of the best genres for approaching big social topics in a kind of very subversive way. Then you don't really think you're thinking about it, and then it's oh, that was actually about something really big.
I mean, a lot of people think horror as just this goofy ghost train with blood and splatter, but actually a lot of it has very strong social commentary. We see it in stuff like George A. Romero's Night of the Living Dead and Dawn of the Dead. He talked a lot about capitalism and racial issues, and even up until as Jordan Peele's films, very strong social commentary. And even the ones that you wouldn't think, like the slashers, even they have, mirroring on society.
Oh, definitely. Like even like, films like just even such as like, kind of Hellraiser and stuff like that. Like pretty much any of those kind of typical kind of like, as you said, the 80s style of kind of, they're just goofy, blood everywhere slasher films. They still say something in a very kind of not obvious way, but like definitely a fantastic genre for dealing with, I guess, societal issues, because that's what people are. We're in a society, so some of the biggest horrors come back to people.
And it's kind of a shame that it's so kind of poo-pooed by, say, like the Oscars, or not that they're the be-all and end-all, but they are kind of flipped off. Even the horrors that have won Oscars, like The Sixth Sense or Silence of the Lambs, they are given genre names such as psychological thrillers or a supernatural thriller, and you're like, you mean a horror?
Exactly. It's like they're just literally afraid of the word horror.
Don't be afraid of it. Embrace it. Come over to the dark side.
We've got cookies.
We do. They are ghost shaped, but they're still cookies.
Exactly.
So what was your introduction to horror? How did you get into it? What was the first horror film that you saw?
Well, introduction to it was, again, through my dad. Like, my dad being a massive creative person, like he's always been into kind of creating special effects, like kind of makeup and stuff like that. Like Halloween is my dad's favorite holiday, and it's mine as well. Like, I've got that's been passed down to me. And so I got that from my dad.
I love the way that horror, unlike a lot of other genres, is like a tradition that is passed on, whether it's through parents or it's through siblings or uncles and aunts or older friends. It's just got this such strong sense of tradition that it kind of harks back to like folklore, and I think that's so cool about horror.
Oh, 100%. It's almost like you said, like folklore. It's like almost that kind of like oral tradition of like passing down the tales of our past generations. Like, you don't really get that sense of tradition and tribalness with, like, romantic comedies.
Imagine being like,
like, it's not like, okay, child, you must watch this classic romantic
really take note of the romance in Love Actually. No, it's just not got the same kind of
no.
I have a child, and I really hope that I wouldn't force anything on them. They can be into whatever they want to be in, but I really hope they get into horror as well. I really hope.
I know. I think it's the one particular genre where you just want desperately that it's like, please, come on.
Yeah. I want my kid to be the kid that goes to school and gets in trouble because they've walked in with like a severed limb special effects. Like, I want to be that mother that goes into school and has to have a chat with the principal. Like, did you know your child? And I'm like, yes, I did. I helped them with it. Who do you think showed them?
Well, I don't know if I don't think it classifies as a horror film, but the first movie that scared me and kind of gave me an appreciation for the spooky elements was Casper the Friendly Ghost. Yes, it scared me so much that I asked my parents to leave the film. I must have been maybe like, I don't know, definitely toddler age. But, so I don't think it classifies as a horror film, but it's the first kind of spooky element film that had an impact on me.
And do you remember what the first actual horror film was?
Yeah, first first like horror film that I kind of remember definitely like really watching was, at least in the cinema anyway, was The Grudge, because
Okay,
I would
yeah.
have been 11, I think, roughly.
Yeah.
But yeah, that's the first one that I remember seeing in the cinema, which I went to that with my dad. And
That's
again, I think,
terrifying for an 11-year-old.
yes, and to make it worse for myself, all self-inflicted, is that we were supposed to be going Alien versus Predator.
Yeah.
That wasn't on. We got the dates mixed up, and my dad goes, "Oh, this film, it's got the one from Buffy in it. That should be fine." And it wasn't. And then I just remember like must have been halfway through the first act. There was one point where I was cowering on the floor between the aisles, and my dad was just like, "You do know we can leave?" And I'm just like, "No, you paid money." And now I can't sleep if my wardrobe is open, because there's a scene in the film where she goes up into the ward.
Yeah.
If my wardrobe is a crack open, I have to go and shut it. Like,
yeah,
impactful horror film.
Yeah, that when I must have been about 14 or 15 when it came out, and I remember it was me and my friends. We went to see it, and then on the walk home, it was pitch black, and we were like, ah! And then of course you see the original, and you're like, oh god,
It's just like, it's the one thing when you're a horror fan, it's like, you know it's going to have this negative impact on you, but you still go and watch it, because it's like, I think it comes back to that that whole sense of like, you're not really in danger. You can kind of experience those, like harkening back to the old times of like having to escape the predator. You can experience those instincts without actually having to.
Yeah, it's like a safe adrenaline rush. You know, it's in a controlled environment. You can get that bit of adrenaline, and then the serotonin's released, and then you hope it's not real.
Exactly.
There's always that, but what if it is real?
Turning the lights off and sprinting upstairs just in case.
Oh yeah. So this week's theme, you actually came to me and suggested it, which I think is really important. So the theme that you came to me with was queer horror and LGBTQIA plus representation in horror. Why did you want to do this theme? Like, I know why I wanted to do it, but why did you want to do it?
Well, I suppose for me personally, it's because like I've only accepted myself as a non-binary person within the last kind of 6-7 months, so it's still relatively new to me. So because I've kind of embraced this big part of me, embracing kind of queer culture and queer history is something that I've like really getting into, like, kind of like, the elders essentially, like learn about those who've come before and the history of this community that I'm a part of, and like seeing like the representation that we get in films as well. Like I think as a society, the films and media is one of like so important to how society views different communities. And I kind of feel like that's one of the main problems why even to this day there's a lot of people that don't accept the queer community, because especially with horror films, there's the kind of age-old trope of the kind of monstrous queer, as in like their queerness was what made them horrifying. And I don't know, I think it's something to pay attention to kind of hopefully see as society feels like it is progressing, and we are mostly, to see that progression within the media as well, to watch it change as society gets more tolerant and accepting, watching how that shifts with media and how it portrays it and gives us that representation.
From my own personal experience, I am a queer woman, and I found that I knew quite early on I was queer. I think it was the first time I saw Tomb Raider and Angelina Jolie, I was like, well, I'm not straight. I actually, I was like, these aren't straight feelings. And I had this little shrine to her, like at the back of my wardrobe, that you had to pull apart the clothes to see, because I had to hide it from my parents, because, you know, it's still my parents' generation. It was still, you know, big thing to be gay or queer, so I had to hide it. And obviously they had no clue about what bisexuality or pansexuality was about, so I had to hide it. So I kind of felt like I could relate to the monsters in horror, and I think that's why I became so fanatical about it, is because, you know, they're ostracized, they're this isn't a word, but I've made it up, monstricized.
I dig it. Yeah. I think it's a good word.
Yeah, good, because it's mine now. I'll let you lose it. So I, you know, they're kind of ostracized, they're freaks of nature, they go against God, and I just related with them. And in a lot of horror films, even now, I root for the monsters.
Oh, for sure.
Yeah. And I find that with a lot of other queer people as well. That's why they're so fanatical about horror, is because of this relation to something that is seen as out of the ordinary or not, you know, heteronormative. Do you kind of feel the same way about horror?
Definitely. I do think, like, there is that, because, you know, the way the cisgender heteronormative society kind of functions is that that's viewed as the normal. Like, that's what normal is. Anything that goes against that is a deviation. And like, the thing is, like, to deviate, the word itself doesn't have any negative context. It literally just means that you've deviated away from what's, you know, kind of more accepted or normal. But society has put this negative, almost monstrous, horrific kind of connotation to it, as in, oh, that person is a deviant, they are a deviant behavior, to make it seem worse. And yeah, I definitely think it makes sense that the queer community, which has been ostracized, has been pushed into the shadows, like, just to think back, like, in Ireland itself, like, being gay was illegal up until the 1990s. You know, so it would have been the case that you could have had, you know, a gay couple that were living together, but society would have viewed them as just being friends and stuff like that. Like, you couldn't be out publicly. So I can definitely understand why the queer community would have this relationship with horror, like, 100%. And I think, and like you said as well, rooting for the monster, it's kind of like, it's interesting to think about, like, as kind of horror movies have progressed, there was, especially with the slashers like Jason and Freddy, they kind of, so many of them were made that it got to the point where it was more about creating these asshole teenagers that were usually homophobic, misogynistic. They had all these terrible traits. So you wanted the monster to kill that person because they were a bad person.
Yeah. I definitely find in a lot of horror films that the actual horror itself comes from the humans rather than the monster or the evil. It's the actions, it is the attitudes of the humans that are supposedly being terrorized by these monsters, and they are the actual real horror themselves.
100%. I definitely agree in that sense that, like, if anything, it's like the monster is kind of put there to help you focus on the actual horrific human beings. Like, it's used as a, I don't know, film, like a device to kind of like help you focus on, okay, this person, like, we're meant to think this monster is the evil, but really it's people.
I mean, it's like if we take Clive Barker's Hellraiser, it's not the Cenobites that are the bad ones, it is the people that are the bad ones. And you know, Clive Barker, he's been such, you know, an advocate for the gay community with his films. You know, with Nightbreed, it was all about finding your people, finding your own family, even though you've been rejected by, you know, your bloodline family or society's normality. Obviously Hellraiser. But when you were kind of, as you said, learning about queer history, did you go back on horror films and have a different kind of viewpoint, a different eye on horror films?
Oh, definitely. Like, especially like films that you wouldn't have even like before when I might have watched them back when I was, believed I was 100% cisgender man and all this,
Yeah,
like like, and approaching it from a new lens, you kind of notice things that you wouldn't have noticed before.
yeah,
And oh, 100%, like going back on horror films, just noticing how almost more horrific the kind of people are, like, as
yeah,
in, especially like as become, as I've grown up and become more and more of a, like, a self-identifying like feminist and queer, noticing things in horror films about like particularly men characters,
yeah,
like her, like really misogynistic and stuff like that, that I wouldn't have picked up on before. And
yeah,
a lot of that misogyny is linked into kind of homophobia as well.
yeah,
So kind of, yeah, like going back on past horror films and noticing a lot of tropes
yeah,
um that are kind of really damaging as well, especially with the
yeah,
way queer characters were portrayed.
yeah,
Like I even watched for actually the very first time, I feel like I'd seen it because it's so famous, but Hitchcock Psycho, I
yeah,
had watched recently for the first time, and with Norman Bates, like just
yeah,
the way they talk about transgender people, like it that was a monstrosity in itself,
yeah.
and
Yeah,
yeah,
I found in particular Psycho. Um, when I was younger, I loved Psycho and I loved Silence of the Lambs because I was obsessed with true crime and serial killers. But then being educated on transgender people, being more aware of the plight they face every day when it comes to violence. Going back and watching these films is horrific because they place them as the monsters, as the killers, when in fact it is completely the opposite way around. Especially trans women, they are more likely to be in a violent crime, the victim of a violent crime or a murder. And it's just horrible to think that these films are celebrated as great, cinematography and blah blah, when in really they're very anti-trans, they're very anti-gay. And in the kind of the case of Psycho, it actually saw a rise in violence against the LGBT community. So it's very detrimental, and I kind of think they should stop being celebrated.
yeah, no, I
Yeah,
definitely agree. Like even like, again, like with Silence of the Lambs, you know, don't like it's infamous because as a film, like it is really well made.
yeah,
You know, hit like Anthony Hopkins, like he is Hannibal. Like it's a
yeah,
very well made, but again, it's just with Buffalo Bill, like the fact that that is the representation that like the trans community had and were given
yeah,
for, like, it's only been within the last maybe 5 years that we've started to see some form of actual positive representation for
yeah,
trans people, and it's still very minuscule if
yeah,
there at all.
yeah,
Like the fact that that was the only representation and it was such a big film, it like films shape society. And
yeah,
like as you said, like you're young, where if you're younger and impressionable and you're watching a film like that, and especially with horror, it is that one genre where you want to watch it before you really should.
yeah, yeah,
Compared to any other film, it's like I'm not allowed
yeah,
to watch it, so I'm going to.
yeah,
And people are so impressionable, and if you're given that negative imagery, like it, like you said, like trying to educate about queer issues, or even like looking across the aisle, like racial issues, like
uh-huh.
trying to be educated on issues that might not directly affect you, when you've had years of the media just like hammering these
Yeah,
messages into you, it takes so long to learn those biases.
yeah,
So I definitely think films like that, we shouldn't be celebrating them anymore.
yeah,
Like maybe like a footnote as in, this
yeah,
film is important because the styles like
yeah,
influenced a lot of directors afterwards, but the actual film itself, the story, we can
yeah,
push that away.
yeah. And I think that, people that say stuff like, oh, but it was of the time, just because it was of the time does not mean it's right. I mean, it's these people, when they were villainizing, that's a new word as well, villainizing, when they were villainizing queer people, trans people, they knew what they were doing. They weren't like, oh, it's just someone in a dress. No, they knew what they were doing. They knew the message they were putting out into society. They weren't stupid back in the 1960s.
Exactly. And also as well, like that concept of it was of the time.
Yeah.
Like it is just like, it's a completely blank statement, because it suggests that every single individual person was of the same belief set back then, which is clearly not the case. Like throughout history, there's always been social justice warriors, activists, people who've actually been fighting the good fight. And so it wasn't like, just because a lot of bigotry was accepted doesn't mean it was a good right at the time, and they knew it wasn't right. They just didn't care.
So the first film that we're going to talk about is Let the Right One In. Do you want to introduce it and give us a brief synopsis about what the film is about?
So a brief synopsis of the film. It's about, like, at the end of the day, it's really kind of a film about friendship and love. And it's, the main character is this young boy, Oscar, who's bullied. He's ostracized. He's like pushed out, and he's suffering, and he becomes acquainted with a young person named Eli, who is actually a vampire. And what I love about the film is that it isn't even about Eli being a vampire. Like the vampirism isn't really the main thing. It's their relationship, which I just think is really interesting for a horror film. But it's about how their bond grows and shifts, and Eli helps Oscar kind of come out of his own shell. And it's the film, like, kind of coming back to what you said earlier about how a lot of horror films kind of really pinpoint the message that is really humans that are monstrous. This film really does a good job of that. In the sense that you see how bullied Oscar is. Like, there's multiple scenes, like, where you see the bullies, like, completely douse Oscar's clothing in urine while he's in the swimming pool, and they attack him, and they repeatedly insult him by calling him a little girl, which I think that whole idea of, like, femininity and women is weakness compared to men, and masculinity is just such a tired trope. But it's a really beautiful film in the way it captures their relationship. And the reason I think it definitely falls under queerness and as a queer film is because Eli, there's this sense of androgyny to Eli, and it's the actress or actor Lena Landerson is the one that plays the physicality of Eli, but they actually had a different actor do the voice to make it almost sound more masculine. And again, it's never confirmed in the film. That's the great beauty of it. But I kind of think Eli could be possibly some form of non-binary representation, because the gender is never really pushed.
Absolutely, I mean, we see a scene where Eli is getting changed, and we get a flash of it's kind of a strange and quite uncomfortable scene. So Oscar's kind of having a peek, like most kids are quite, they're quite curious, and he has a bit of a peek, and he notices a scar across where Eli kind of the genital area is. And then Oscar asks Eli to be his girlfriend, and Eli says, "I'm not a girl." And Oscar just kind of accepts this, and he's like, "All right, do you want a date?"
Exactly.
And I think that is so pure.
Exactly. And I love that, because that, I feel like that is it just really shows that pureness. Like that's what children are. Children are pure and innocent. Like, negative attitudes and bigot, like that's taught. Like everyone has that innately. Like so it just shows that Oscar is this just pure, like, heart of gold kid, and which makes it worse that he's the victim of bullying, because it's, why are you picking on this sweet child? Like,
and it's the character of Oscar. He's so pure. He comes from a broken home. His mom is very distant. She kind of rejects him a lot. She's never around. He's viciously bullied, and he has these kind of little play fantasies about, being violent towards these bullies. And so you kind of expect him to carry on this cycle of violence and aggression, but he doesn't. And he's so kind and he's so sweet to Eli, even when he finds out that, Eli's not a girl. When he finds out that they are a vampire, it's just, he's just so pure of heart. And I think it does this really good thing of kind of a stark contrast to the actual horror and darkness in this film.
Oh, 100%. And I think, like, the way the film is done, in that it doesn't really focus on Eli as a vampire, really helps in showing how monstrous the bullies are. It's just their relationship, and going back to when Eli says, "I'm not a girl," like, I think it's like, it's really clever, as in, on the surface it could literally just be Eli going, "I'm a vampire," but it's that deeper level of like, well, actually I don't think so. It could be something more. And there's that glimpse of later on in the film, before Eli kind of leaves, like kind of telling Oscar, be like me. And there's that glimpse of, it's almost like an old man almost, but it's this like kind of masculine features, age masculine features. So it's like really that, like, one, like, Eli is definitely a lot older than the 12. But also, does Eli have a gender, or like, I just think it's really subtle. And I like that. Like, I think that is definitely the way a lot of queerness is dealt with in certain films, is that it is kind of subtle. It's like, there's crumbs there. There's like, there's enough representation. There's enough to kind of make you question, but it's not blatant or in your face. Like, now there could be another discussion about whether that's a positive or a negative. But I think that's the way queerness is dealt with in a lot of films. It's kind of just suggestive. It's like, well, do you really want to touch it?
I kind of feel like when queerness is almost coded, or it's slightly suggested, it's like, as you said, breadcrumbs for the queer community. It's like, it's kind of like, if you know, it's like that little kind of, it's a nod, it's a kind of a support almost. And sometimes, I would like out and out representation, because, as you said, society is influenced by media. It needs to be shown in a positive light. But at the same time, it's nice to have that little bit of, that's just for us.
100%. And I think as well, like, when it comes to the outright representation, which we are getting more of, it seems to be that the only kind of stories we get when it comes to outright representation is about queer trauma. And it's like, if it's a choice between breadcrumbs, where queerness is just depicted and there's no negativity or positivity associated with it, or queerness is here, but all you're going to see is the trauma and the pain, you almost would prefer to see that breadcrumbing, because at least you don't have to deal with that trauma. So, but the film is like, the right one in is just it's a beautiful film. It's really well done, like, especially because there's the horror itself, when it is depicted, is also very subtle. Like, particularly the last scene of the film, like, is, I think, one of the best kind of kill scenes I've seen in a film. Like, because it's done so subtly, like Eli being held under the water, which is also about the possibility of drowning. That
Yeah.
itself is horrifying. And then you just hear the screams, you see a head fall underwater at the background, and then you just see the bully's hand kind of just severed limb float past, and it's like you never see any of the killing. And that's why I think the original Let the Right One In is so much better than the American remake Let Me In, which is still good and has its strengths, but at least that particular scene in Let Me In, they show everything, and it's like, oh, don't show us everything. It makes it less scary.
I actually haven't seen the remake because I love Let the Right One In so much that I feel I would be betraying it. Now, a lot of people have been like, no, you have to watch it, you have to watch it. And I just feel that because, you know, Let the Right One In was based on a novel by a Swedish writer, Jan Lindqvist. I'm sorry, my Swedish family would kill me. They'd be like, you're not saying that right. And I just feel that when a text is within a culture, within a society, and when it is taken out, we see it a lot with Asian films, when it's taken out of that culture, it loses its meaning, especially when it's Hollywoodized and Americanized. So I haven't seen it because I feel like I would be very disloyal to the original. So does it lose some of its kind of cultural references?
I definitely, because I literally watched it last night, kind of to compare in advance of this. It definitely does lose some of that kind of element of it. Like it's just, it's randomly just set in New Mexico. It still has which I find weird because it still has the snow, and I was like, I didn't realize New Mexico got snow.
Same. I thought
they
were
just desert. So that was like peculiar, but it still has the snow and the winter kind of themes, and they have some of the same lines, but that's kind of the only similarity. It's very different in its core, and you can feel that, like, because it's been removed from the way it's told, and it's a lot more in your face. Like, Eli is a vampire. Like, they show a lot more kind of killing and limbs being torn apart. Like, Eli is more monstrous, which I was like, that ruins the character, I think. And it completely rewrote the story, because in Let the Right One In, it's, Eli and Oscar are the two friends, but then there's also the friends of, like, the kind of other community, like the neighbors. Like, there's like the three adults that are all kind of friends, and they have their own kind of mini story, as they're affected by Eli coming into town. And there's that last scene where one of the men whose best friend was killed by Eli ends up taking it upon himself that I'm going to hunt down and kill this monster. And just in the scene where he's about to open up the window and burn Eli effectively, Oscar comes in and says, no, don't. And then Eli kills your man, because it was a threat both to Oscar and to Eli. In the American remake, they don't have any of those, that mini story that's happening separate. It's just a random police officer who kind of walks into the apartment, so that you lose those extra layers of subtext and storytelling, which just lends itself so well to Let the Right One In and making it such a powerful film.
So going back to Eli's kind of gender identity, as I said, it's based on the novel, which was done in 2004. The film was 2008. In the novel, it's explained a lot more, as novels usually do. In the film, as we said, there's a brief kind of glimpse. In the novel, it turns out that Eli was an assigned male at birth child who was castrated and then made into a vampire. In the novel, they do not identify as male or female, so they are a non-binary character. So it's kind of interesting that they didn't decide to do the backstory.
I didn't actually chose. I chose the film, but I didn't even know it was based on the book. So bad research on Tadhg's part. But I will have to.
I got it through Wikipedia. I did not read the book. I'm not that committed.
But that's a really interesting fact, and I think it kind of comes back to the whole breadcrumbing, as in being deliberate and telling it this is exactly the case.
Yeah.
Like, I think it's something that, unless it's a queer filmmaker, like someone who's queer making the film and involved with it, there's just this, and even though the film is Swedish, it's still like kind of a Western film. So there's just this feeling from people who are putting money into making movies that nobody's going to want to see that story. We don't want to put money into that story. So I feel like it was maybe the script writer, the direct, like their way of kind of, well, we want to include this part of the book. This is Eli. We want to give Eli their character, their authenticity, but we want to do it in a way where they'll let us make it. It would be interesting to kind of actually find some form of interviews by the director or the screenwriter to see what came into making it. But I'd imagine that's probably what it is there's that pushback when it comes to telling queer stories, unless it's going to be queer trauma. When it comes to telling queer stories, it's kind of, you have to kind of figure out a way to carefully get it through the cracks.
And I mean, unless you are part of the community, you're, if you're cisgendered, if you're kind of hetero leaning, you're going to miss that. You're going to miss those breadcrumbs, which I think is kind of a shame, because it's so many people's stories, not so much the castration part, but, not identifying as any gender, or identifying as both. And I think it's important that people start to realize how normal it is,
100%.
And I'm kind of sad that they kind of missed out on that, but maybe it wouldn't have got made, unfortunately.
Yeah, it's one of those, unfortunately, the grim realities of queer stories, like, and the way they get told. And that's even if it, and the queer stories that do get told, most of them are about white queer people. Like, so Black queer stories are even more few and far between. Like, so but I do wish that there was more representation of people who aren't like cisgender, people who like just proof that like gender is this just made up social like
exactly
gobbledygook. So I definitely hope as we kind of move forward, our films start to kind of tell more stories, and we are seeing it. Like, there are, in the, not a horror thing, but in the DC show Supergirl, there's a mainstream trans superhero, and there's more trans and gender non-conforming characters coming into our media, mostly on the small screen in TV shows, which does tend to be the way that characters get introduced. It's kind of on the smaller screen, which typically studios will say less people will be seeing. It's completely different now in our age of streaming, but it's kind of the way it's done. Like, we'll test it out here. If it gets kind of good traction, then we can make the movies about it.
So going back to the film, let's focus on kind of the vampire depiction. As we said, it's not overt, but a thing that kind of interests me, a lot of vampire films are all about sex, all about sexuality, whereas this story is a desexualized story. It focuses on the love between Eli and Oscar rather than the usual kind of overt sexualization. And obviously you can't do that with kids. Like, that's wrong.
That's a line too far.
But it's kind of interesting how the original author kind of chose to do this story and base it on pure love, because I suppose another thing that people kind of have got this awful stereotype about queer people is overt sexualization. And you see it a lot in 80s films where the characters go to leather bars and it's all about sex and blah 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 blah, whereas it's not.
Exactly.
It's exactly the same as hetero love. It's love. I mean, there is sex, but it's love. And I like the way that they introduce a desexualized vampire relationship to kind of portray that.
100%, I completely agree, and that's so true about like kind of stereotypes about queer people in the queer community, is that it is hypersexualized, and that is typically the vampire films. Like, vampires are the super sexy people who are going to seduce you and convince you to give yourself to them. And this film like is derived of that. It doesn't appear at all. And I think as well, one of the great scenes when it comes to the vampirism and Let the Right One In is, again, those group of friends that are just affected by Eli being near them. There's the one woman who gets bit but survives, and then we see her kind of slowly turning into a vampire, and her kind of coming to terms with that, and then her breakdown, and then that like kind of really sad but also kind of very kind of horrific scene where she's in the hospital and she just opens the curtains because she realizes she doesn't want to be this creature. She just decides to burn and die. And I think that's another thing that doesn't really always get captured when vampire stories get told, is dealing with that monstrosity. That, like, there is, I guess you could say with the Twilight films, Edward Cullen, the depressed, I don't want to be a vampire. You kind of get that in sometimes there is that kind of one vampire that's like, oh god, I hate being a vampire. all these people I have to kill.
I know, we saw it in Louis in Interview with a Vampire as well.
But I did really enjoy that, how it was a completely different vampire movie. It done away with the tropes, and it had as well, it wasn't really a vampire movie at all. Like, it was kind of just the character happened to be a vampire. That, like, it wasn't about vampirism or them being a vampire. We didn't have to deal with the lore or vampire hunters or anything like that. It was literally just the love. And you could see, like, I loved as well that at the end, that kind of final scene where Oscar has kind of made the decision to be Eli's companion, you realized Eli's father, their father, was also a previous Oscar, like a kid that had fallen in love with Eli and decided to protect Eli and help Eli survive. So I liked that as well. It was kind of just showed that Eli isn't a monster. Like, Eli is also a kind of a beautiful tortured soul.
I mean, I definitely feel that comparing the novel to the book, comparing the novel to the film is a lot more kind of innocent and is very based on pure love. We see it in the character of Hakan, who is Eli's kind of guardian. He's the character that goes out and tries to find people to feed on. Unfortunately, the book reveals to us who Hakan is, and it's very grim. Okay. And I don't know if I should spoil it for you, because you'll watch the film again and be like, no.
Oh no, give the context.
Okay. So in the book, Hakan is a pedophile, and he falls in love with Eli, and that is why Eli kind of keeps him around. So looking back now, you're like, oh, that's very dark.
That is very dark. And then that kind of, in the end, that kind of actually, that means that the American remake actually kind of maybe made it better.
Okay.
Like, in the sense, because in the American remake, there's this scene where you see Oscar kind of going through Eli's like kind of collection of knickknacks and things, and sees a picture of Eli with Hakan and the American version as a kid, as Oscar's age, like a photo of the two of them in a photo booth. So I think maybe the American film was kind of more going towards possibly more innocent, less grim.
They were like, let's just plaster over that bit there. The Swedes were a bit more like, let's, kind of hint at it, but yeah. So would you recommend Let the Right One In when it comes to queer representation, and in particular non-binary representation?
100%. I would definitely recommend it. Like, even though it is mostly suggestive and it isn't a forefront of the film, like, just purely for the fact that Oscar accepts Eli for who they are, there's no kind of shrieking back, and there's none of that, or there's no intrusive or invasive questions. Eli or Oscar just accepts Eli for who they are and still loves them. That alone, for any form of non-binary representation, that, like, I would take as a takeaway to definitely recommend it, because non-binary people, we're no different than cisgender people. We're still as valid and worthy of love. So 100%. And as a general film, recommend it as well. But for queerness, non-binary, definitely would be a 2 thumbs up.
As you've said before, it is a film that does not play on queer trauma. And I think that's really important as an example of that. So the film that I chose to do was quite a recent film, and it has got such a reputation. Such a reputation. When it was released, people were apparently fainting in the cinemas and throwing up and needing ambulances, which is kind of ridiculous. Like, obviously these people weren't, horror film fanatics. Why go to a horror film if you're not a fan? Like,
exactly. Don't understand.
So I chose Raw, which is a 2016 film written and directed by Julia Ducornau, stars Garance Marillier, Ella Rumpf, and Rabba Nate Ufela. So it follows the story of Justine, who is a very strict vegetarian. She has been all her life, starts a semester at veterinary college, and a hazing ceremony, which is kind of like an initiation we'd mainly see it in America with like frats and that kind of stuff. It sees her being forced fed rabbit kidney by her own older sister, who's also in this college. So after ingesting this piece of raw meat, she develops a rash, but also an insatiable hunger for raw meat. There's this fantastic scene. Fantastic. Her sister accidentally gets her finger chopped off and Justine eats it. And I was like, for anyone that sees it, you're like, is she gonna? Is she? No, surely. And she's like licking it like a cocktail sausage. And she's like, and then she just starts munching on it. And it's not like a stuff it in my mouth and gulp it down. She's like nibbling on it like a little like chicken wing. She's like, and it's just amazing. It's brilliant. You always see cannibalism as like this thing where people are like gulping down bits of meat, but this one, she was so petty about it and just like
this tasty little morsel.
So then she finds out that her sister has also got this condition where they like to eat people, and her sister has been causing car crashes and then eating the victims of the car crashes. And her sister kills her roommate Adrian, and then that's pretty much it. It's all about that cannibalism. As a cannibal kind of centered film, what did you think about it?
I thought it was like really cleverly well done. Like, as like you said, is it didn't kind of show it as them be kind of like being almost like feral, like kind of like monstrous. It was kind of just like we just eat people.
It's fine delicacy.
Exactly, 100%. But I think my favorite thing, bar the finger eating scene, my favorite part of the film is the literal last reveal. Like,
such a good reveal.
It's one, because like the thing is, like, throughout the film you don't really like, it doesn't really kind of explain it at all. It's just kind of like, you're just like, oh, why?
Yeah.
And then it's like, oh, that's why.
Yeah. So spoiler alert, the end of the film, her sister's in jail and Justine is sitting down with her father, and her father reveals to her that her mother also has the condition, lifts up his shirt, and he is
just like covered in.
They have been into some kinky shit, man. Like, imagine finding that out from your parents. You'd be like, oh, no thanks.
I did not need to know that.
Yeah, you're like, keep it to yourself. And so we see from this, you know, the very beginning of the film, it's her mother being very strict about their vegetarianism, you know, very militant about it. She freaks out when Justine accidentally gets a bit of meat in her lunch towards the end, where we see that her mother is actually has this cannibalistic condition as well. So it's a great
puts
full
everything
circle.
Into context.
Yeah. They're like, yeah.
That makes so much sense.
So let's talk about the kind of the queer subtext, the undertones of this film. For me, it was very symbolic of repressed sexuality.
Yes, definitely. Like repressed sexuality, but also the problem of like, which they kind of goes hand in hand almost, but compulsory heterosexuality.
Yeah.
Like something that definitely happens a lot to cisgender gay men and cisgender lesbian women, like more so than kind of trans people, because that's a different type of thing. But like that, like so many lesbians experience it and gay men, where you date people of, because it's one, you either know you are but you're trying to repress it, or you just assume you're straight because that's what you're supposed to be. That's what society tells you. We only have straightness. Everyone is born straight. Like, so really, and especially like his kind of reaction to the one kind of traumatic scene between him and Juliet. It shows how kind of traumatic compulsory heterosexuality can be for people in the queer community.
I mean, we see it obviously in Juliet, and we'll get onto that symbolism in a bit, but we see it as well in her roommate Adrian. He is a gay man. He's talked about being bullied his whole life for being gay, for being out, and they end up having sex. And afterwards he gets so angry because he's like, I did not go through 20 years of bullying and being ostracized for me to turn out straight. You know, it was such anger about it. And like you said, it is about being forced into a hetero mold, and just that anger. And even when it comes to kind of when you kind of realize that perhaps you're bisexual or you're pansexual, there's still that kind of like this idea from society that you're either actually straight or you're actually gay. You're just a bit confused if you're in the middle. And we really see that anger with Adrian. Being obviously bisexual, people are always like, well, if you're a bisexual woman, you'll end up with a man, and if you're a bisexual man, you'll end up with a man, you know. It's just, you can definitely see his frustration.
100%. Like he's angry. Like he kind of, his character kind of represent, like it's almost like he represents the anger that, like, particularly because he's a gay man, that gay men have, but the queer community at large have towards the assumptions. And especially I think as well, just when you're talking about being bisexual or pansexual, like what makes it even, like, there's so much bisexual, pansexual erasure within like society, and it even comes from, which is so frustrating, the queer community as well. Like you can be in a straight passing relationship, which means you're straight. Like it's like your identity is voided because you're not actually with someone of the same gender, and which is just balderdash, but it's just very frustrating. Like
I think people forget a lot that sexuality is also fluid. Gender is fluid, sexuality is also fluid, and they are so desperate to put people and their sexuality into very strict categories. You're either into men or you're into women. You know,
Exactly.
you shouldn't deviate. And it's such a shame to see it from our own community as well, because, you know, it's biphobia is very real and it's very damaging. And it's like, sometimes it's like you have to go back into the closet, you know?
Oh, exactly, 100%. Like, I think it's like you're saying, coming from the own community, it's like the kind of the cisgender white lesbian and gays are so, they want to be accepted so much by mainstream heteronormative society that they like they'll push people who aren't like, who don't fit that mold, that like,
Yeah.
as in, because we've gotten to the point where lesbians and gays, the straights mainstream society, we're okay with you. Like, we're
Yeah.
okay with our stereotypes of you once you've
Yeah.
matched those stereotypes, but we're okay. Anything else, no, we're still a bit iffy about that.
Yeah.
So yeah, it's very damaging and hurtful to get it from your own community.
Yeah, absolutely. So going back to Raw, let's take a look at Juliet's character and what she kind of symbolizes. So for me, being a queer woman who hid her identity, her sexual identity from her family for so long, I really felt for Juliet that she had this overbearing mother. And even though she had these urges, I mean, in the film, obviously it's cannibalistic urges, I saw it as sexual urges, and she had to hide it. And it was this guilty, dirty little secret. And she had this hunger to be able to express herself and to live herself as her authentic self. And I really kind of related to that character because, again, you know, to my parents' kind of viewpoint, I always had boyfriends. They didn't know that I also had girlfriends, and you know, I've had partners who are an array of genders or identities, and I felt that growing up. I had that hunger and that drive to be able to express myself, not only with my family but also with the friends group I was in. When I lived in Australia, it was a very male dominated friend group. We were all heavy metalers, and they saw my sexuality as appealing to their straight male gaze. You know, I was that girl who kissed other girls and, oh, she's so sexy and wild. And, you know, it's exhausting having your identity, having your sexuality kind of for other people. It's not for other people, it's for me. So how did you feel? Sorry, that was a bit of a ramble there. A bit of therapy session. Welcome to Therapy Corner. How did you feel about Juliet's character and what she went through and what that symbolizes?
I really, it was the symbolism was so powerful. And I definitely I think it is as well, is that it's that going, they captured the whole kind of going to college, university so well. And even though strict hazing rituals aren't really they kind of happen with some of the societies in the Irish colleges, but it's not as big as it is in America, because there's no frats and stuff like that. But even though that's not that prevalent to Ireland, it's still that kind of you're going into this new world, and there's all, as you said, there's all these new temptations. There's it's different people that you wouldn't have went to your school with, so you have that chance to kind of, as you said, you have the urges, and you actually now have almost the freedom to kind of pursue them. And it's that freedom that's presented to you can almost be so daunting and make you not want, it's almost fearful, as in you now kind of have that freedom. You're no longer at home, you don't have the parents kind of watching over you, your every move. So it captured that kind of going into university as a new person and exploring new parts of yourself. It captured that really well. And yes, the symbolism definitely showed the kind of struggles of having to deal with something that is not normative, is different. And depending on your upbringing, a lot of the times you view that urge that you have obviously in this film it's cannibalism, but like if it's queerness, you view that urge as something that is wrong. Like cannibalism is, but
what are you talking about?
It's good symbolism. We're all nibbling on fingers every now.
Dipping it in buffalo sauce, like.
But also, coming back to the finger scene, the poor dog was done dirty.
Oh my God, that poor dog. When she blamed the dog, I was like, you bitch. Livid.
It was just like, that poor dog did nothing. And what's worse is the part, like at the end scene, the reveal shows that the dad knew this cannibalism ran in the family and still went on with putting down the dog. It's just like,
what got me, and like, I suppose again, this is another symbolism of like, if you talk to your children, it will save them if you make it a safe space for your children to talk to you, you will save them a world of hurt. Imagine if her parents had sat her down and her sister down and said, look, you have this condition. It's not accepted in this society, but you can learn to live with it and you can learn to manage it. I mean, obviously, the way we talk and we feel about queerness and, you know, gender is a lot more open than being like, you've got to keep it a secret because it's, you know, it's very bad. It's not, well, I'd hope it's not that way for anyone nowadays. And I'd hope the new generation of parents, I'm hoping my, you know, generation of parents are a lot more open with their children about discussing gender, about discussing identity, about discussing sexuality. And I just feel, obviously we wouldn't have much of a film to talk about, but I just feel all her problems. Why didn't her parents talk to her?
Exactly. Like, it's just, yeah, it is. And I think it feels very apt, like watching it from being in Ireland, where it's definitely a very common thing that parents don't really have an open dialogue with their children. And not even when it just comes to queerness, but just in general, having a healthy sex life. Like no, it's just like, you know,
sex is still a sin, you know.
You can't be talking to her. Like, it's like, so it really just shows like how much like problems that teenagers and young people have,
absolutely,
which could be avoided if parents just had an open, if a kid felt that they could go to their parent without any fear of being judged, like it would make things so much easier. Like,
I mean, for me, like, my job as a parent is to raise my child so they're not an asshole. that's the number one thing. But it's also to provide a safe space for the future generation. And whether that is for my child, whether that's for their friends in the future, whether it's for my, you know, nieces or nephews, I just feel that it's my generation's job to start providing the safe spaces that previous generations just didn't hold within their own household, within their own family unit. And I think this film is a really important representation of what can go horribly wrong when 100%. Children miss out on that.
Oh, exactly. Like it's just such a simple thing.
Yeah.
And
I mean, talking, it's what we do best.
Exactly. But like 100%, it's like, it really just shows that, we just need healthy, open communication, and things will be so much easier. Like, please just talk to your kids. And also the main important thing, which actually, you know, which you've said on previous episodes, which I just love, that is, talk to your kids as people, not like as in that's what they are. They're small people, they're developing people, but they're still people. They're not like
absolutely
a kid. Treat them as a person. And I think we need just an across the board approach of that to be able to hopefully bring it forward into future generations. But I think that's always the difficult thing, is that when you do have people who are raised in kind of very strict and conservative households, it's very hard to book that trend. That kind of gets passed on, like, so
important.
like that's the unfortunate
Yeah.
consequence.
It's all about trying to break that cycle. And I think it's important for people who have those safe spaces, who have those family units where they are listened to. I mean, listening, we say, talk to your kids, also listen to them, listen to what they've got to say. Because, it's important that your kids have that level of trust with you, and then they can bring other people in that may also need that trust as well, and I just think it's really important to, as a parent, have that open relationship with your children, so you can also perhaps be a light for other children in their lives as well.
Oh, 100%. Exactly. Like, healthy open communication creates healthy and open people. Like, so.
Yeah. I mean, and it saves so much money on therapy as well. So much money.
Oh, so much money.
So really, it's a financial thing.
Like long-term goals.
If we're talking in capitalist terms,
like, it's really a valuable investment.
Right? You're investing. It's an investment. So Raw, would you recommend it as queer representation?
I really would. Like, I definitely think so, because one, the symbolism of Juliet, of what it symbolizes, kind of how queerness can take place, but also the character of Adrian, who is a queer character. And like, I do think like there is that, scene between him and Juliet where it is that kind of almost darkness of like, it isn't really sex because he wants it to stop. Like, so it is kind of assault, and it kind of, I think that's a really good, it shows that is something that a lot of gay men do experience, is being almost used as props by women that they know. It's something that unfortunately it has happened, and it does happen. So I think the film does a very good job of capturing that and kind of portraying it and not making light of it either. But overall, the film, I think, for the queer subtext and the open queerness, definitely would recommend it as a film. And also just purely the finger eating scene alone, like,
it's
just
finger licking good.
You prepared that.
I didn't. I just thought of it. Sometimes I'm funny, like. But I mean, usually I ask which one would you recommend over the other. I kind of feel you can't recommend one over the other when it comes to these two films, because they represent two very different, we've got one about gender and then we have one about sexuality. And I think they're just as important as each other.
100%, especially to kind of hit home that message that they are different, like gender and sexuality can both be fluid. They're not static, but they are two very different things. So someone could never question their sexuality, but could go through their life questioning their gender.
Absolutely.
Or you could have someone who knows 100% that they are cisgender. That's not something that ever applies to them, but their sexuality could be causing them questions. So I definitely think probably a good kind of double bill. Two different types of films that kind of fall under the queer umbrella.
And I mean, they're not too gory. I mean, I know everyone was giving out about Raw, but I don't think it's too bad.
No, I definitely don't think it's vomiting in the theater and needing an ambulance gory. Like, no, and neither of them are too gory. I definitely don't think so. Like they kind of definitely fall under that kind of more almost psychological, like, not like they are horror, like, as in it shows it, but it's not a slasher. It's not a show. It's not a Saw or a Hostel. It's definitely more kind of veering on the psychological subtext horror.
Absolutely. And are there any other films you'd kind of recommend for? I know we did mention a few. We mentioned a few of Clive Barker's ones. In the introduction to this episode, I mentioned Nightmare on Elm Street 2. which has glaring neon signs, gay subtext. But are there any other films that you have experienced that you're like, yes, this is a piece of me?
Well, no, I haven't really come across any that are kind of like definitely kind of deal with kind of specifically gender that I would kind of like find myself in. But as a good, like, well, I enjoyed it for what it was, but a kind of good modern queer film is What Keeps You Alive, which is kind of a low budget Australian one, but it's kind of a very good example of a modern queer film in that queerness has nothing to do with it. They just happen to be two lesbian characters, and the killer in the film is just a killer who happens to be a lesbian. So I think it's good to see that there are good queer films being made where queerness just exists but isn't the reason the story is being told. So
it's not this massive like plot line, you know, it's just
exactly.
That's
and
who
there's
they're
no more monstrous queer, like
exactly
queerness isn't what makes them a monster, which that was very refreshing to see. But
what I really loved about that film, and especially the casting, was that it was actually written for a hetero couple, but then when they kind of got their the actors auditioned, they were like, no, we need these two actors, and they became, you know, they then wrote them. Well, they didn't really need to rewrite anything. They just were like, okay, there's a lesbian couple, you know. And I love that it wasn't about like, oh no, they can't act because they're a lesbian and we need a straight man. It was, okay, they're the right one for the job, and we're going to put them in this film as just
exactly
a lesbian couple. And that's it.
100%. And I think like that kind of almost like harkens back to like, not to do with queerness but with race, with Romero casting the main character in Night of the Living Dead. Like Romero is famous for constantly saying that he was just the best actor. The characters, like, it wasn't written for a black man, it was just the best actor. But once he was cast, it completely changes how the film works and is told. And I think the same with like What Keeps You Alive. Like once you put it through that now queer lens, it completely changes the subtext of the film and of how it works. And like hopefully we kind of do get to a more kind of refreshing point of like where characters aren't written a certain way. It's just like the best, kind of, it's the best person kind of gets the role. Like, and especially I think that would probably hopefully do away with a lot of queer stereotypes and queer tropes, in the sense that we're not writing a queer character, we're just writing a character. Like, you know,
and hopefully even when a character is written as queer, that it goes to queer people, that when a trans character is written, it's going to a trans actor. You know, we've seen it when what's his name, that arsehole, Jared Leto, he was cast, sorry, I can't stand him, I hate him so much, when he was cast in the Dallas Buyers Club, and he get an Oscar for it.
He did.
It's like,
which
why?
Makes it like a slap in the face.
Worse. Yeah, it's like, why are trans characters seen as Oscar fodder, but they are not given screen time as people, as actors, as, you know, people of a craft? And it's so frustrating. And I think, you know, that's why we've got great people like Laverne Cox who are really championing trans characters and trans actors.
100%. And a great, unfortunately, the season that's about to come out will be its final season, but the series Pose is such a positive representation of having trans people playing trans characters. Like, it's so easy to do. It's like, it's not like there's none of them. Like, there's a lot of them out there to play the roles. Like, you know, just like, they're right there. They're asking for the work. Like, you know, it's just, it is frustrating in that sense. Like,
so that definitely covers what our hopes are for queer representation and LGBTQ plus representation in horror films.
Mhm.
I was going to ask, but I think we kind of perfectly covered it there. So before we go, I always ask, what is your favorite horror film?
Oh, what was my favorite horror? Like that is always like, a
How
horror
long you
fan's
got?
first question. Exactly. It's just like, are we here for another hour? But favorite horror film, I definitely like, even though it's probably, cliche, but it is one of the films that I always go back to for rewatching. But John Carpenter's original Halloween, like that
Okay.
film is just, I just love it, especially when when I go back to rewatch it after, because new films that are made now, they're so quick and fast paced.
Yeah.
It's all about like scene, jump scare, scene,
Yeah.
jump scare. It's really about keeping you on your, constantly kind of being knocked backwards. Whereas with Halloween, like it's slow.
Yeah.
And he's just this threat that's constantly in the background. And it isn't really until the very kind of last act of the film that he kind of becomes the kind of monstrous killer. But I always go back to Halloween. I think it's just one of the it is just such a good classic horror film. Like, so it probably is, it's one I always return to. So I think that's why it could kind of be considered a favorite. Like I always have a revolving door.
Of course,
I always return to John Carpenter's Halloween.
Yeah. Oh, that's great. Yeah, I'm probably a victim of fast-paced horror films. Is that, I didn't watch a lot of the classics until later on. And so I was used to the fast pace and the, as you said, the jump scare, the big loud music. And so when I watched Halloween, I was very much like, is that it? Like, really, this a classic? But then as I've kind of gone back and I've really started studying horror, I've studied history of horror, and I've studied the craft of making a horror film, it's then that you go back and you truly realize that, yes, it was absolutely a classic,
100%. And especially, I think the way, that kind of to go into like film, but like the way Carpenter, like the camera itself isn't passive. The camera plays an active role in telling the story, which was Carpenter was one of the first people to kind of really do that. Like, that opening sequence where the camera's going up to the window and stuff like that. And like now when you kind of watch a lot of modern horror films, that's almost a given. So to kind of see when that was first introduced is just really, it still stands as a film today.
Yeah. And I know you mentioned The Grudge, but what is the scariest horror film you've ever seen?
Well, that's definitely up there because it still impacted me. Like it depends, like, because there's scary films because they kind of like were scary in the sense that it was like almost made your skin crawl. But then like I've also seen like the Hostels and the Saws, which are just gruesome, like like in a different way. But like I do love, like, and it still gets me every time, but the first Insidious film, there's just that one sequence where it's just that creepy little demon child just like jumping in the background. You just hear that song, Tiptoe Through the Wind. Like that song is like, it's just seared into my brain. So the Insidious film is one that I constantly love to rewatch because it still scares me every time.
I kind of feel the same about The Conjuring. The first Conjuring still freaks me out, something awful. Thank you so much for coming on and discussing such an important topic. Thank you for approaching me with it. It's just been really nice to discuss horror in a way that it is important for representation, and it's nice to kind of be a fan of a medium that is intrinsic in portraying it. So thank you so much.
And thank you for having me on. It's been very enjoyable being able to talk horror and queerness and everything wrong with society.
And how shit everything is.
Exactly.
So that was my chat there with Tadhg about queer representation and representation of LGBTQIA plus communities within the horror genre. So we discussed two films. That is 2008's romantic horror from Sweden, Let the Right One In, directed by Tomas Alfredson. And it was also 2016's cannibal film, Raw, directed by Julia Ducornau, and kind of their representation of gender and sexuality. So as ever, if you have anything to say about this week's subject, or whether you think that we could have picked better films, what films you think have positive and correct kind of representation of the queer community, let us know on our social media. So that is Instagram and Facebook at What a Scream Podcast, or you can email us at whatascreampodcast@gmail.com. And don't forget, we are also on Letterboxd, so you can keep up with previous films that we've discussed and films that we will be discussing in the future. We also have our mini-sodes, our mini episodes, in case you've missed, and it's where myself and my co-host Neve discuss recent releases, and we give them little reviews, and we also talk about, you know, the weekly topics. It's a bit less serious. It's mainly just us shiting on about stuff. So yeah, check them out if you haven't already. So as ever, I hope you are staying safe. I hope you're looking after yourself. I hope wherever you are just taking time for a bit of self-care, whether that involves watching horror films or sleeping lots during the day, taking medication. That's okay too. And as ever, don't forget to stay horrific. Goodbye.